when we talk about research and documentation, like many of us mentioned, going into research is very time consuming and it's very complex, and the human resources is really a real constraint. Most museums, we might not have people with an anthropology background or any sort of background. There might be archaeologists or museum studies, but maybe have never really had to work with living cultures or work with people so much. And particularly in countries in which you have to work across different languages, that obviously brings in a whole number of difficulties as well, whether you're really understanding a concept or not, whether the staff who might be from a majority culture are reinterpreting answers or not. So through research and documentation, there's just the act of going through research and documenting intangible cultural heritage is immensely complex. And I think a lot of our museums are facing kind of difficulties in finding the human resources to do this. Exhibitions. Well, we had a little bit of a debate we didn't get into yet as to whether you can actually show ICH in exhibits. It's true, I mean, showing a video isn't necessarily the same thing. Not everyone wants to look at a video. It's easy to look at an object and walk away. Generally, portraying sort of intangible cultural heritage is done through photographs and videos and audio and that kind of thing. However, that requires more budget and technology as well. Education-wise, trying to communicate to visitors to a museum or to children, etc., intangible cultural heritage is much more abstract. And it's much more complex. When we were talking about livelihoods development, when I was talking about all the handicraft work that we do, what I didn't really explain is also that my co-director actually spends a huge amount of time on this. And actually what I didn't say is also for the research, my museum, I think we have 13 staff at the moment, 14 staff. So it means that each one of us is doing a huge amount of work on our own. I tend to focus more on the research work. It takes up a lot of my time. And my co-director does a lot of work on the livelihoods development, working with the communities, going out to communities, the travel time, etc., is very time consuming. And of course, working in communities, we talked about internal community politics, so that is something that definitely comes up. And just working with rural communities is a challenge, I think. And one of the things that is particularly in developing countries is that a lot of the importance of intangible cultural heritage, I would say intangible cultural practices in the communities we're working in, the source communities, isn't necessarily valued themselves. In some ways it is, in ways that we cannot see ourselves as outsiders. But in other cases, as I was saying, many of the older people talking about younger people simply moving to the cities, going to school and not valuing kind of traditions anymore. That's happening quite rapidly as well. And it's a more complex task for us to go into a community and say, well, what are your important, rituals and what are your important traditions? So finally, to just kind of to conclude and to wrap up, there are a lot of responsibilities when working at a museum that represents living cultures. We do have to be careful as sort of outsiders how we're trying to portray or try to portray these communities that are still in existence. I would say in some places it's great that we have people from those communities that are able to be part of the museums, but in other cases that's very difficult. In a developing country, the issue of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage is even more acute, is even more urgent. And this is because there are so many rapid kind of changes happening, both positive changes and negative, I would say. I mean, one of the examples I often use is about handicrafts. A lot of people say, oh, well, the young women, they're no longer doing their traditional handicrafts and weaving and doing embroidery. But on the other hand, a lot of them are getting an education, which they never did before. You can't say necessarily that's a bad thing. So there are positive and negative changes, but it's important, we feel, for the communities to recognize themselves the changes that are happening and to decide, which way they want to change and which way they don't. As I mentioned, there's a lot of more of a cash dependency in a lot of these communities that we're working with, and that leads to a lot of sale of cultural artifacts and a lot of seeking work outside of the community, which means that a lot of practices are left. And in many cases, there are a lot of integration. I'm sure in China, there's a lot of the issues of integration into a majority culture, or how a majority culture chooses to categorize and to kind of organize the minority culture and how they look. So this is, for us, even more of a reason why safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage is an important part of museum work. Thank you.